Hello again, this is Matt, and this is the third video of my C++ Beginner's Guide series on YouTube. And in this video, we're going to be going over the program that we wrote in the last video, and we're going to analyze each line in the C++ code, looking at what they do and why they are necessary. Again, just as a note, this is pretty much a compilation of information I previously wrote on my website. In particular, this post, dissecting the simplest C++ program, talks about everything we're going to be looking at in this video. So if you haven't quite understood the ideas presented here, please have a look at this article. I'm pretty sure that it should be clear enough to you after reading all of this. So let's get straight into it. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to open your IDE of choice. In my case, I've got Visual Studio 2019, but if you've opted for the CLion installation, open CLion. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to open that simple program directory. I know that for my case, I can see it here on the left, but if you can't see the simple program directory that we created in the last video, just navigate to it. In my case, it's on the desktop, coding, and simple program. Open the folder. And as you can see here, we've got everything that we had in the last video. So we've got the main.cpp source code, we've got the CMake lists, which tells CMake the structure of your project. Again, if you don't know what this is, please refer back to the last video. Watch that. I explain how to make a very simple CMake project with just one source file, i.e. main.cpp. And this is the source code that we had. So this is the CPP code here. I've zoomed in quite a bit so you guys can see the text better without me having to edit the video too much and zooming in everywhere. So the intention for this video is to go over this file here, main.cpp, and I'm going to explain every line and why they are necessary. Now I'm going to begin by talking about this int main function here. If you think about it, when you open an executable, a program in your computer, such as Google Chrome, Visual Studio, or even a game that you play, as soon as you open that program, the computer needs to know where to start executing. So which lines of code are going to be executed first as soon as you open that program. And int main, this whole line here, this whole block of code here, is the entry point of your program. So this is where your program will start executing. So everything inside these curly braces will start executing first. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that int main, this line here, line 3, defines a function called main and returns values of type integer. Now, if you don't know what a function is, don't worry too much. If you know a little bit about mathematical functions, it's essentially the same in programming, in the sense that functions in programming are pretty much a black box where you put some values in and you get some values out. Okay. In the case of C++, this is pretty much a standard definition of a function. So main, which is the name of the function, takes no parameters. As you can see here, this is what the open and close brackets mean, no parameters, and returns integer values. This is what comes before the name. And everything inside the open and curly braces is the code that executes once this function is called, once this function is executed. Okay, just to summarize, as soon as you start your program here, simple program, once you compile it and execute it, the code that's going to run first is everything inside here, the int main function. Okay. Now the next thing that we have is what we call the scope of the function. So the code that runs when the function is called. And this is represented by line 4 to line 6 here. And in C++, you indicate the scope of the function by opening the curly braces after the function definition here, as you can see, and closing the curly braces. So everything in between the open and curly braces is the code that runs when you run the function main. Next up is the std cout hello world. Now this is a little bit more difficult to explain because firstly we need to actually talk about this first line here, include iostream. In C++, hash include and then whatever comes after it will essentially tell the compiler to take this file iostream and copy the contents of it up here where the include is. So this is what the compiler is going to do. In C++, you can actually see what this iostream file is and what's inside it. By hovering on the name and pressing F12, it will take you to the definition of that file. And you can see where the file is. If I actually zoom in here, you can see that it's in C programs, Microsoft Visual Studio, community, blah, 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 iostream. And this has a lot of code here. So essentially what the compiler is going to do is it's going to take all the contents of this file and copy it to the top of my file here, main.cpp. Okay. So to be more specific, this is called an include directive, and it tells the compiler to copy all the code inside this file that comes here at the top of your C++ source code. In the case of IOStream, it is a header that comes with the compiler by default. So most compilers, such as Microsoft Visual C++ compiler, GCC, and Clang on Linux will all have this header available for you to include it. And this is essentially how you include code defined somewhere else, maybe in your project or in your system, inside your source code with the include directives, okay? And we're including IOStream here because it defines this functionality here. So it defines std cout. In C++, this is called a output buffer. And this buffer will essentially output the message to the console. So std cout stands for console output, if I believe, and it's part of the C++ standard library. That's why you've got an std : here. This is called a namespace. Don't worry too much if you don't quite get these things yet. This is just the first time we're seeing this, but I will go into more detail in the future, okay? So this line here essentially says hello world to the console. So hello world is the message being sent to what we call the output buffer, the console output buffer. And the syntax to do that is what you can see here. So there's a less than sign after cout and the message after it, okay? So if you run the program, you should see that it just says hello world and exits, as you can see here. So your program runs, says hello world, and exits with code 0, okay? Now it's interesting that you can see a code being returned from your program, so code 0. So what does that mean? Long story short, that is the value returned by your function main, okay? Now you might be wondering where that 0 comes from, and essentially by default the compilers will automatically add this line of code after your function main. So by default the compiler adds a return 0 if you have no return statement in the main function. And this is only valid for the main function. This is not a general rule for functions in C++. So in main, if you don't add a return, the compiler will automatically add a return 0 at the end of your function. And by convention, 0 means success, and anything that's not 0 means a failure. So unless you don't want the default behavior to return a 0 to say that everything worked just fine, unless you've got a very good reason not to, you would use return and then another value here to indicate the error code of your program, okay? So if I return -1, you should be able to see when you run the code that you returned -1 here on Visual Studio. And it's essentially the same on C-Line as well. You'll be able to see the output at the bottom tab, I believe, of your IDE. Well guys, I'm going to leave this video here. I think we've actually gone through quite a lot, even though there isn't much code to go over. But again, if you haven't quite understood everything that I've explained in this video, please read this post that I created on my website. It talks about all these things in much more detail and in a much simpler way to understand it, I believe, as well. Everything is in text, so you can just reread it if you haven't quite understood something. If you have any questions, if you have any issues compiling the code that we went over in this video, please let me know in the comments and I will try to help you. Okay, so until next video, bye-bye.